survived it, yeah. Yeah, when I got, I brought out last time, realized there's no room, so I'm gonna bring it in. But that's what I was worried about, the downpour hitting me when I was taking it out of the car, so. Yeah, I mean, it's just a little bit too small in there.
That wasn't popular.
Yeah, those are always fun to look at.
Not all of it's from here.
It's more or less what you,
Yeah, I can't do that. I like it.
but they're all, ProMap company is organic, so certain pages are.
Hello, my honey, hello, my ragtime gal. Send me a kiss by wire, from the heart's on fire. If you kiss me, honey, please let me
But I mean, the photography back then was so grainy, it's hard to tell where the scenes are. I don't. It looks like it was darker and it stayed darker. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what year that was.
Maybe it is. I can't tell.
My mother told me stories. I wish I could remember what she told me about things, but she worked with different people down there.
Look at those baskets.
And she had, there was one of the guys that she worked with, who was probably about, I think he about her age, I can't remember. maybe
And then, and then they rebuilt and they went, well, wait a minute, we're gonna have to go differently because
You know,
it opened up.
before he retired, he kept
Yeah.
on here, he teased her saying, and he said, when I die, please don't put me in.
Yes. Hi, Clay.
Might be out of
Hello. Cried? No. She. Well, and also we left the thunder.
For it's only a shanty in old shanty town. The roof is so slanty it touches the ground. Roll down track, oh, railroad track. It's calling me now. Give up the palace if I were
All right, you guys have fun.
Thanks for coming by.
Joe, please give Joe a round of applause for coming here today and being our special guest. Thank you very much.
So Joe, tell us what your earliest memories of this home are. sitting in a clamshell when I was about 2 years old. A giant clamshell from Australia.
And that was here in the home?
Yes, he had several here.
Where in the home was the
Well,
clamshell?
he had them mostly in the yard as decoration, among a lot of other totem poles and shells and well, shell mounds and all that stuff. It was quite a place for the tourists to see. The sightseeing buses used to stop here and let people out, and they'd come up to the fence and look at the totem poles in the yard. My grandfather was out in the yard, he'd be talking to them. The next thing you know, he'd invite them into the house, and my mother never knew who was coming through the house. But he'd invite them in because he had a lot of collections in the house, seashell collections, miniature collections, and several other kinds of collections. And he was always very proud to show them to people baskets. He had a basket collection. And he would show them to people and talk about it. He liked to entertain people. And he did the same thing in the shop. My father came into the shop early on after he met my mother. And 3 years later they got married. But my father was more of the salesman type, and he's the one that kept the shop going. He'd bring in the money, but my grandfather would entertain the people.
Joe, tell us about the personality of your grandfather. What kind of a guy was he? And some stories about, I remember you talking about him being reluctant to sell some items from his store.
Well, he would be showing somebody an item that they were interested in, curio of some kind, and as he talked about it, he would start to realize how rare it was, and he started to like it a little bit better. And pretty soon he'd tell them it wasn't for sale. But he was a wonderful gentleman. He had a great sense of humor, and he used to keep us laughing all the time, and he liked to entertain people. And he thought Seattle was the best place in the world to live. He was a great booster of Seattle. He had lived back east in Virginia, and he lived in Denver, Colorado, where he met my mother and had their family. But when he heard about the gold rush in Seattle, he did the same thing as he did when he heard about the gold rush in Denver. He came to Seattle, and he had a few curios with him that he'd collected. He had a grocery store in Denver, and anything of interest, he'd tack it up in the grocery store, any kind of a curio or whatever. And pretty soon you couldn't see the groceries for the curios. But he started this he met an Indian friend here in Seattle, and the two of them built a little shack down near the waterfront. And what curios he had brought with him from Denver, he put in the shack, and he did business with the Indians. He kidded the Indians along. They liked him. Seattle was a pretty wide open town in those days, and there were a lot of Indians here, and also explorers and people going in and out of Alaska. And he befriended those people. They liked him apparently because they'd bring him beautiful carvings, ivory carvings, and things like that from Alaska when they came out during the winter. And so he really made a success of it, of his shop. And it wouldn't be an easy thing to do. Seattle was a wide open town in those days, so he was one of the ones that made a success of his business.
What do you mean by Seattle being a wide open town?
Well, it's too bad you don't know what that means. Unless he does and is trying to fool us. Anyway, yeah, it was full of loggers and fishermen and all that, and they were always when they weren't working, they were hitting the saloons and other places of interest. So, but anyway, they all took a liking to my grandfather, which was amazing. I guess they liked him. He always was in good mood. He liked to entertain people, make them laugh, and he made a success of the business.
How did he get to West Seattle?
that was an interesting thing. At the time, in the early 1900s, they were trying to develop West Seattle, and they offered a 5-cent ferry ride from Seattle, from downtown Seattle, to West Seattle, to stimulate people coming over this way, the people that were trying to develop West Seattle. So my grandfather took advantage of that, and he liked it so well that in 1906 he built his home here, and that's this one that we're sitting in today.
So why this area? I mean, in relation to the ferry, this is pretty close.
Well, it is. And at that time, there weren't very many cars. They used to walk down the end of Ferry Avenue here and catch the ferry, and you could ride it each way for a nickel. So it was a pretty good bargain, and it helped develop West Seattle.
So, can you take us on a tour of this house? You're sitting in the living room, and there's a dining room and a kitchen. But was this all the same when you grew up? What was it like then?
Well, it's similar. We had a piano over here, and this was called the front room, and then we had the living room, and then we had a big dining room off the living room, where we had a ledge in there where my mother raised canaries at one time, and then he had 3 bedrooms upstairs, and it was a great house for having been built in 1906. That goes back a long way. Do you have a question?
We still have 3 bedrooms.
You do? Well, that's good.
So what do you remember as a little boy? What would you do in the various rooms? Were any rooms off limits? Where would you spend your time?
None of the rooms were off limits. We had collections of miniatures and things in the house here that were of interest, but the yard was what was interesting. We had a big yard, and we had that little miniature log cabin that my cousin built with a 2-bladed axe. He was out here from Indiana taking forestry at the University of Washington. Wonderful guy. He was about 10 or 12 years older than I was. I used to kind of look up to him. We had an old lawnmower that, in those days they built lawnmowers that weighed a ton. I could hardly move it myself. He'd balance it on his chin and out in the yard. He was quite a guy. He built that little log cabin that we had with nothing more than a 2-bladed axe. Anyway, we used to play in the yard. We'd play hide and go seek behind the totem poles. But we would, during the winter, slide down Ferry Hill on our sleds and skis. The older people had skis. But it was a wonderful yard to play in. They used to have what they call a playground contest every year, put on by the Seattle Times, I guess it was. And we fixed up the place here. We had swings, and we had a basketball court and a place to roller skate, and we had that little log cabin. And we'd win the prize every year. We won it for 3 straight years, and finally they came to my mother and said that we'd like to give you the prize again, but if we do, nobody else will be interested in future years. So they gave us the second prize that year, and then we didn't participate anymore after that. But anyway, it was a wonderful place for kids to grow up. We used to play hide and go seek all around here, and all the neighbor kids would play. We'd play cowboys and Indian and all that.
When you were a boy, what was your understanding of the significance of having totem poles in your yard? What did your grandfather tell you about that? Why did he want them in the yard?
He wanted something that would attract people's attention, I guess, and it was a great way to do that, to have totem poles. Not many people had totem poles in their yards. The sightseeing buses used to come by regularly and have people look at the yard and all that.
And where did the totem poles come from?
Well, we direct relations with the Indians. They were carving those big poles for us for many, many years. And the prices were good too. Boy, now the price of a totem pole is almost out of sight. Yes.
When you say your yard, did you have more land around the house at that time?
Oh, yes. My grandfather had over an acre here. It ran from Palm Avenue to Ferry Avenue, and it ran from here down 2 more lots. His son lived at Standley. My uncle lived in the home down here at the other end of this property. But there were two more big lots where this house, this 3-story house, here was our sunken garden, where we used to play croquet and play hide and go seek and all that kind of thing. We had that swing and trapeze and all that. It was out there too. And we used to play softball in there too until we got too big and started hitting some of the windows around there.
What were some of the places around the house in the neighborhood that you enjoyed as a little boy? This Admiral area is full of parks and businesses.
Right. We used to go up and watch the baseball games up at Hiawatha Park. That's where the high school played baseball. I went to Lafayette Grade School when it was a big 3-story brick building that fortunately it was spring vacation when the earthquake came in 1949 and it damaged it to a point where they had to tear it down. But all these bricks came tumbling down on it, both entrances. If the school had been in session, I don't know, we would have lost a lot of kids. I told my dad about how the wall would shake when you put your foot up against it. So we used to take walks together on Sunday, and he wouldn't believe me till we went over there one Sunday, and I got in a little alcove there between two brick walls and braced myself, pushed up against the walls, and it shimmied all the way up to the top. My dad was convinced that when the earthquake came, it didn't take much for that to be shaken down.
Talk a little bit about the business of curios. Your grandfather won a prize when he was in grade school that kind of got him started, but I also want you to talk about your own interest. I mean, you don't have to follow in your family's footsteps. There must be an interest in you in the same thing.
It was such an interesting business that and my grandfather, as I was getting older, I wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer or something. He always used to talk me out of it, and I guess he finally did, because when I got through school, that's where I ended up. But I used to work there part-time when I started when I was 12 years old. We had a big convention here, and that was the first time I started here in 1936.
What attracted you to curios?
Well,
you yourself.
The curios, the definition of a curio is something that attracts attention and interest, and so people just naturally are interested in curios. It's something a little different, rather than it has more than one meaning to it when it comes right down to it, or more than one use. I guess the definition of a curio is something that attracts attention.
And how did your grandfather first get attracted to them? He won a contest in grade school, I believe.
Well, yes, he was in the 3rd grade in Steubenville, Ohio, where he was born. And he won a prize for having the neatest desk in the class. And the prize was a book that told all about curios and interesting countries all around the world, and that attracted his attention. And from then on, as a boy, he used to roam the banks of the Ohio River and also the nearby caves of West Virginia, looking for Indian artifacts and Indian heads and all that. He just was completely enthralled by that. And in those days, there were a lot of curios around like that. So as he got older, he started his own shop.
So when did you leave this home? And did you ever come back to West Seattle in any sense?
Well, after my grandfather died in 1940, I believe it probably was about a year later that we finished a home up on 37th Avenue here, and that's where we moved. And my grandfather had left the home to two of his children, my two aunts, and my dad had worked in the shops since 1915, and he and my grandfather's son inherited the shop, the old curiosity shop. And then, pardon? Well, my mother was part of it, sure. My mother was Daddy Standley's youngest daughter. I lost my train of thought now, but anyway, that's the way the shop went until my uncle died and my father bought out the other half of the business, and so our family owned the whole business by that time. It was in 1949, a long time ago, and I worked there after I got out of the Navy. I worked there for almost over 50 years until I retired. And it was an interesting business. I enjoyed it very much. I took a couple trips around the world collecting things, and in those days it was, well, I guess there are a lot of things that are still available today, but it was even more so then.
What are some of the public's favorite curios over the years? The most famous, perhaps?
Well, the shrunken heads were the most interesting thing for people up until the time we got Sylvester the Mummy. And Sylvester is really the most interesting part of the collection, I guess, that we have. And it's been featured on 3 different TV programs over the years. The last one was just last fall.
No, just a few weeks ago.
Was it a few weeks ago?
Geographic.
Well, the National Geographic did another one where they had these 2 scientists tell all about the body and how it was preserved and all that. And it was an extremely interesting show. Maybe some of you saw it, but it was on the National Geographic channel.
And Sylvester has a companion, right?
Well, this fellow came in about 10 years after we got Sylvester, which was in 1955. He came in about 10 years later and said Sylvester should have a companion. So he had this woman, Sylvia, and we took one look at Sylvia. We didn't even think Sylvester would like her. but we ended up buying buying her from this fella. So Sylvester's had a companion now for the last 50 years or more, and she's perfectly preserved too. But she had been buried in a cave in the ashes and slowly dried out. But Sylvester was preserved with gallons of arsenic, and he's perfectly preserved. They still can't believe it, and they say that if the Egyptians had known about arsenic like that, they could have saved a lot of cloth. But Sylvester's really been our top attraction. A lot of people thought it was a fake, but he's all there, and these scientists they can't get enough time to research it and examine it.
What were the circumstances of you getting Sylvester? How did you learn about it?
Well, apparently he was found in the Gila Bend Desert, and he was owned by this fella out of, I think he ended up in Denver. Was that something? Anyway, he took him on, this is in 1897. They had him back at the Smithsonian for a year for all kinds of tests. And then he took him around on these side shows all around the West and had him on display. Charged admission, of course, for people coming to see him. And he became famous. And when the fellow that died was the son of the original founder, died. His wife didn't want Sylvester in the house. She had him in storage. But the original owner had him in a settee, and he was laid out under the bottom where the cushions were. And he'd have visitors come to his house and say, he'd ask them, you want to see what you've been sitting on? And they'd look startled, you know, and so he'd have to stand up and he'd open up this thing, and there was Sylvester laid out in there. So he had a lot of fun with it, but his daughter didn't want to have anything to do with it. And she wrote us about him. And at first we thought it was some kind of a gimmick. We get a lot of letters like that, you know, that might be something good, it might not. But the more we found out about him, the more literature she sent to us, and more stories about him, we knew he was authentic. So we ended up buying him from her. She wanted to sell him. She didn't want him around. So we were just lucky that she contacted us rather than some other people would have been interested to have a display like that. Coupled with the fact that apparently he had no relatives that wanted to claim him or anything. He apparently might have been look careful of the law, because he still to this day has buckshot shots in his face, and he wouldn't go to a doctor to have that removed because then he'd blow his cover. So they just healed by themselves. And then these fellows that examined him found that, along with a lot of other things that were interesting about him. But so he's been our #1 attraction.
What?
We've got time for a couple more questions, I'm sure. I know Dorothy has one and Brad has one. Go ahead, Dorothy.
I want to know how much Sylvesters go for nowadays.
Well, I guess you might say they're priceless. I hate to lose him, but we can't afford to insure him for $1 million, you know, because the cost of that would be prohibitive. But so we're pretty careful of it. But he's our #1 attraction, without a doubt.
Do you know what happened to the totem poles and other big things that used to be on this lot?
Yes, they were put back in stock and eventually all sold, all over the country. Over the years, we've supplied museums in all over this country, in England, and in Europe. And so those poles are all spread around, and hopefully people are taking care of them. My grandfather gave that original totem pole to the city that stood at the top of Averill Way, and the park department didn't do anything about him. They just let him weather. They didn't want to paint him because they were afraid they were going to change the colors, and eventually it just rotted out. And that was a very valuable pole, a lot more valuable than the one that sits there now. The one that the park department, there was 2 employees carved. I guess that's in West Seattle now, isn't it?
That's the one at our museum.
Yeah, that's been saved, thank goodness. But the original pole that my grandfather gave just rotted away.
I was talking to you about the tea house and your mother's involvement in that before you started to give your talk here. Why don't you talk about that a little bit? That was a fascinating story.
Well, when my mother was 19 years old, we were living here. Of course, he'd been living here since 1906. He built her a Japanese tea house on the property, just an authentic tea house. And she was very pleased with that, I guess, and enjoyed it over the years. But over the years, it wasn't used very much, of course. When I was 12 years old, my grandfather wanted to, if you have have a place, a den or something like that. So he lined it with white pine and we had a little stove in there and had all kinds of pennants and things that kids save, you know. That was a great little house for a kid 12 years old to have. And I wasn't in there very long until my mother contracted tuberculosis, and we, rather than send her, the doctors, rather than send her to Furlands, it was a sanitarium at that time, we put her out in that tea house, and we took all her meals. My sister made all her meals and took them out to her, and in 2 years she was completely cured. And she liked that outdoor air so well, she stayed out there even when she got well. It was a swell little tea house.
Any other questions? This is your opportunity. Olivia.
What was your favorite memory of Debbie Standley?
Well, that's a good question. I guess my favorite memory is that he was always very kind to me, and he had a good sense of humor, and he liked to entertain him. He would tell me a lot of interesting stories, and I think he was one of the main reasons why I decided to go into the business. But, he was a wonderful grandfather.
Anybody else?
Do you know what happened to the tea house?
Not exactly, it's gone, but it was still there when I left.
It was.
But the same thing with the little log cabin, that's gone too. So those two things were two of the interesting parts that were here for many years, but I guess they just rotted away. Anyway, I appreciate very much the interest of everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to tell.
Out of the goodness of his heart, he's here with us again. 3rd year in a row. It's becoming a tradition. Please welcome Greg Lang.
Great, thank you.
And if I know from before, he has some visual aids, so perhaps Dorothea or somebody else could help hold them up when that time comes.
Sure.
That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. The reason why I asked the question about the tea house is because there is an amazing collection of photographs that were done in the late 1930s by the assessor's office, King County Assessor's Office, where they went around and photographed every building that was standing at that time. And so this is a blow-up of the Standley house that was taken in 1937. And it notes that there was a rustic bamboo summer house that was 9 by 13 feet, and that was the tea house. And then there was a log playhouse that measured 6 feet by 8 feet in size. So we don't know where they are, but it was somewhere close by here, close by to the property. The other interesting thing that's noted here is that in 1937, they estimated the rent to be $27.50 a month. The other thing when I was doing the research on the property is that, as Mr. James said, the property was much larger. It was about, from here, about 200 feet down to your nephew's name was Edward, or your uncle's name was Edward?
Uncle Ed.
Yeah, Uncle Eddie, yeah.
Ed Stanley.
So that's how much yard space there was. So this house is just 50 feet fronting on Palm. Well, it went down another 150 feet to Uncle Eddie's house. So it probably did deserve the first place prize in playgrounds. I guess he was talking about that earlier. See all times put on. So what I am going to be talking about today is not if the walls could talk, but if the ground could talk. Because I'm going to be talking about what was here before the house was built. So it all starts in 1862. There was a crew of three land surveyors that were out here surveying the Wamishet area, the West Seattle area. They took about a month to survey the entire area. And they did the survey because before you could homestead here, the survey had to be done. And that was done in October of 1862. So they were surveying the whole area. They went out to Alki and up along Duwamish, and on what was the date here? On October 3rd, 1862, they were going down from the head of the Duwamish down the shoreline, and near where the Seabird condominiums are on Harbor Avenue, 1221 Harbor Avenue Southwest, they saw a cabin that was Edward G. Lamb's cabin. And I just said you couldn't homestead before the survey was done. Well, he was a squatter. He wanted to get first in line. So he came out here in 1860, or at least I think it was in 1860, built the log cabin, and just was basically waiting for these surveyors to get their act together and get this thing surveyed so he could homestead it. Now, Edward Lamb came out west. He was raised in the East Coast, came out west in the early 1850s. California Gold Rush brought him out. And he decided that it was more worthwhile for him not to search for gold, but to be a ship's captain. So he was a ship's captain that went up the Sacramento River. And he had such ships as Captain Sutter, El Dorado, Georgiana, and he had another ship that he captained called the Seabird. So here we have the Seabird condominiums, and he was the captain of the Seabird. So I don't know if the owners of that did the research to come up with that obscure fact, but if they did, it would be quite amazing. So just to give you an idea, the Seabird came out here in 1851, and it was again, it was a California Gold Rush boat. It was 225 feet long, side wheeler. And then after that gold rush was over, they came up to the Fraser River Gold Rush, which happened in 1858. And it eventually got wrecked, as most of those ships did, and didn't survive to 1860. So when you leave this place today, you can look at this land that's around us and say, because of this land here, the University of Washington got built in Seattle. And the reason for that is, in January of 1861, the Washington Territorial Legislature awarded the Seattle the Territorial University. Before that, from when the territory was first established in 1853 up to 1860, it had been kind of thrown out as trading ships and horse trading and town promotion, so that people could say, we are the future home of the university, or we are the future home of the penitentiary, whatever it was. They were using that as kind of a promotional angle. And in 1860, and nobody had any money, right? So they didn't have any money to build it. So when the legislature met the next year, then it would be tossed over to somebody else. And so it kept on being traded back and forth. Well, Bagley and Denny had an idea that they were going to get the thing and they were going to get it built. So what they did was they were able to work the angles and have the University of Washington be awarded to Seattle. But they also did one other thing. When U.S. Congress established Washington Territory, they gave 2 townships, which is 72 square miles of land, to be used for university purposes. And basically, most people thought that was basically an endowment. Just once the university got established, it would kind of maintain the university. But Bagley and Denny had a better idea. They slipped in a law in the territorial legislature to be able to sell that land for improvements for the university. So, and they realized that they only had a year to do it, because if they didn't get the thing built in a year, then the next year when the legislature met, they would pull the rug out from under them and toss it over to somebody else. So time was of the essence. So it got approved in January of 1861. By February, they chose the site, which is where the Olympic Hotel is, in downtown Seattle. By March of 1861, they started the clearing of that 10-acre tract. They laid the cornerstone of the UW building, the classroom building, May 20th, 1861. By October of 1861, they had completed that building, the president's house, and a dormitory that was enough room for 25 to 30 students. And November 4th, 1861 is when they held their first classes. Legislature met the following month. There was hell to pay. They didn't like it, but it was too late. So they set up a delegation to look at the university. They approved it. Everything went through. So it was because, and how did they finance it? Everybody back then didn't have any money. It was a barter system. Basically, nobody had any cash whatsoever. And so what they did was they were able to sell some of the land to ship's captains, to sawmill owners, things like that, to people that actually had money. And then for the workers who did the work, they would not pay them in cash, but they would pay them in land. They had to sell this land, this 2 townships of land, 72 square miles of land, at $1.50 an acre. And they were paying the men to work on this university building $3 a day. So they would get paid 2 acres a day to do the work on the university. And Lamb paid cash for 146 acres, which includes this area where we're standing, and along the waterfront, and that's really what got everything going. And it actually became known, the very earliest name for this point, it wasn't Duwamish Head at that time, it was called either Lamb's Point or Captain Lamb's Point. So, once Lamb bought the land and had title to it, he hightailed it back down to California. And a couple of years after he bought it, he sold it to a gentleman by the name of John Williamson. And John Williamson was a sawmill operator. So he had come out here, he sold it to Williamson in 1864. Williamson had come out here in 1853, worked in sawmills, operated sawmills for a number of years. Then he came out to the point here, bought the land with some investors, and started to build a sawmill. And this was kind of the first industry out on the point. And from that point to about 1881, this property was always referred to as the Freeport Mill property, because that was the name that they gave to the village and the name of the sawmill. It's interesting, the origin of the name Freeport, I think, was the reason for that name was because the wharf that they built did not charge dockage fees. Over in Seattle with Yesler's dock, which was the main dock in Seattle, he charged fees to dock there. But so they were using it as a promotion for people to come out to this dock instead, and there would be no charge for fees. So he got a little bit more traffic that way. Also, you'd think that this whole area is pretty sedate and nothing much happens. Well, between 1864 and 1879, Williamson was a local and he didn't have money to invest on building a sawmill, but he got investors, a number of them were in California, and I counted up the number of deeds of various investors trading back and forth this property, and between 1864 and 1879, 15 years worth of time, there were 22 deeds that passed back and forth. So it was really, action was going on all the time here. So John Williamson, his early days, he had little opportunity for schooling, and he was really thought of as a genius for mechanics and steam engines. And steam engines, of course, were the power that was used back then. And he was just a genius of it, but he didn't have any schooling. And he was asked that question, why, how come you know so much? He said, it was all because of the magazine Scientific America that I learned everything I knew about steam engines, and he was kind of world renowned, at least in this area, regionally renowned for his knowledge on that, and he was called, his nickname was Old Combustion. So, sawmill was built. Sawmill was doing wonderfully. If you were standing out near the ledge looking over where the sawmill was, which is just below us here, on April 8th, 1867, there was a description of the sawmill was enveloped in a sheet of flame. So it totally burned down. So anybody who was here on this site where we are today would have seen the smoke rising and maybe even a few flames rising up. It was totally destroyed, but it was immediately rebuilt. And such that by 1870, the village had a population, the Freeport village had a population of 55 to 60 people. The mill employed 34 people, and 16 of them were Kanakas. Kanakas were Hawaiians that were brought out here, and it's very likely that they were brought out here. These Kanakas came from the Hudson's Bay Company. Hudson's Bay Company used Hawaiians to do a lot of their farm work and field work when the Hudson's Bay Company was here. And so they would be hired for 5-year contracts, and then at the end of that 5 years they had the option to go back to Hawaii, or they could stay here to re-up. And there was actually small communities of Kanakas that were established. San Juan Island has Kanaka Bay. There was Kanaka settlement on Salt Spring Island in Canada. So there was little enclaves of them, and so there was workers that they didn't have Chinese at that point, and so it was the Kanakas. And also Freeport did a lot of shipbuilding, so there was a number of ships that were built, fairly large ships too, at that time. So we jump ahead to 1877. A gentleman by the name of Ezekiel Marshall bought out Williamson. He bought him out in 1875. And then by November of 1877, Freeport was renamed Milton. And I haven't been able to figure out why that name was. One reference said it was because it was a shortened version of Milltown, but I kind of have my doubts on that. Here is a description of Milton. And this is probably when it was the most prosperous. And it was in the fall of 1877. There was a letter in the Intelligencer, the Post-Intelligencer, of coming over here and visiting Milton. And the steamboat left Seattle, and it departed from Seattle's forest of ships' masts, is how they described it. And then they're describing their arrival at Milton. It says, quote, "The hills around the bay," and this was in the fall of 1877, "the hills around the bay at this season of the year are most beautifully variegated with foliage, and the bay is dotted all over with steamers, canoes, and sailboats. Milton Sawmill is a large one and is running constantly. The dwelling houses are neat and comfortable looking and are built in regular order and have all those neat gardens about them which attract your attention at once." And he docked at the wharf, which could hold up to 7 large ships for loading of lumber. And then they did a walk around. This article doesn't describe this, but I came across a listing of all the buildings that existed at Milton at this time. The sawmill had 40 to 45 employees. By then, by 1877, the Chinese had replaced the Kanakas. There was a blacksmith shop, carpenter shop, cookhouse, root house, a store, the Ocean House Hotel, which had 15 rooms, 9 cottages, 14 cabins, and there was a 2-story residence and a 1.5-story residence. One of those, no doubt, was Marshall's residence, since he was the manager of it. And there was also a piano in the house. I came across a reference in 1874 that's describing they have to feed all these people, right? So there was a farm that had 20 head of cattle, 100 hogs, and about 100 geese, ducks, and chickens. So you would be hearing a little cackling down below the hill. But that was, like I said, the height of existence there of Milton. And then times became rough. Sawmill business was really an up and down business depending on the economy and how much was going on out there. And so between mid-1879 and March of 1884, for that entire time, the sawmill only ran 7 months. And the reason why it just ran that length of time is because there was a lumber dealers association in San Francisco, and they paid the mill not to run. So it was kind of a monopoly, and so they gave them just a little bit of money not to run. But during the brief times that they did run, they produced the railroad ties for the Northern Pacific Railroad. So they were producing railroad ties, shipping them south, so as the railroad was coming towards Seattle. And they also, the lumber was used to build the Fry Opera House, which is in a lot of photographs from that period of time. There's a lot of photographs of Fry Opera House, which is probably one of the more prominent buildings and So the lumber that was made here was used to build that. Okay, 1880. The freshly cut, the smell of the freshly cut timber was replaced by a slightly different fragrance at that time. If you were standing here on May 15th, 1880, you would see a steamboat pulling a barge towards the point. And it was the Myers Salmon Cannery that was being hauled down. Their works were being hauled down from Mukilteo. So all the cannery operation was being hauled down here. Now, why did it happen at that time? Well, the reason why it happened is because in January of 1880, there was an enormous snowfall, probably the greatest snowfall that Seattle has ever seen, and the Mukilteo Salmon Cannery got crushed by the weight of the snow. So the cannery got destroyed. Myers was trying to figure out whether he should rebuild or what he should do, and since Seattle was the main distribution point by that time, he moved down to Seattle because it was easier to distribute his cases of salmon. So he rented some space, and it was probably south of here, about 5 blocks is where the cannery was. And he rented a building from Marshall and some land. And Mr. James was mentioning it was an open town. Well, that building that they rented was a former brothel, is what they rented in 1880. And so that was probably the last brothel that was in West Seattle. But you'd have to go into Seattle to get something else. In the summer and fall of 1882, so they got their salmon, and they bought the salmon from Italians who were the fishermen, and then they had 40 to 50 Chinese who were actually working on canning the salmon. And to give you an idea of how big this operation was, in 1888, it produced 81,000 cases of salmon, which was basically distributed back east. April 11th, 1888, the cannery burned. There's an issue with fires out here, I guess. It was immediately built, and it was a fairly large cannery. The main part of the building was 40 by 80 feet, and then there was 2 wings that was 36 by 60 feet, so it was a fairly large operation. They had to bring in 100,000 shingles to shingle this building. So they built it, everything was good, until August 24th, 1890. It burned down again. The owner suspected arson both times. So he was not, he was kind of the end of his reign here on West Seattle ended because he gave up West Seattle and moved his operation to downtown Seattle. And so he rebuilt the cannery in downtown Seattle. And so that was the last of the aroma of rotting fish. Okay, so we're moving ahead, and that's kind of the end of industry and the development of the town in the early days. Between then 1880 and 1884, it's interesting when I'm doing research on property, it seems like Arthur Denny has his fingers on every piece of property in the county. He had this property for a while. Again, the Freeport Mill property, which was just referred to. But eventually, there was a gentleman by the name of, in March of 1883, Ura Nietzsche arrived in Seattle. He was born in 1849 in Ohio, taught school in the 1870s. 1878, he landed in Denver and was a boot and shoe dealer. Then he came out here in 1883. He started work for a title company abstractor. So a title company abstractor, when I was doing the research on this property, I put together all the deeds to the property, which is all this here. And this isn't all of them. So and these are just so it's probably close to 100 pages, 125 pages of documents. And so they would go through that because whenever you get a title report, that's the equivalent of what's being done today. It ensures that there's no claims against the property when we buy it. And so that's what he did, and that company also was involved in real estate. Well, he got inside word that this property out here in West Seattle was becoming open for purchase. And so in early 1884, he started assembling this property. And in September 26, 1885, he formed a plat, and the plat name is the West Seattle 5-acre Tracts, which is there is the West Seattle 5-acre Tracts, and what I've highlighted in yellow is where this property is. So it's interesting to look at this and then compare it to what happened 3 years later. And it's also interesting that Niche, this boot dealer, he did not have a lot of his money invested in that because he immediately sold it off. About 85% of those tracts that you saw on that, he within a week after filing the plat, he transferred a lot of the land, I think it was 70 tracts of those 82, to other people. So he basically was the front man, and then there was all these investors that were involved in the property. So, the tract was sold. That tract 15 was sold. It was one of those properties transferred in September 26, 1885, and then that was immediately transferred to William Lewin, who was a real estate dealer. And then about a year later, it was transferred to J.A. Campbell, who was another sawmill worker at the Port Blakely Mill. 1885 is not a good time to create a plat. That was in the midst of a depression here in Seattle. And so there was really a lack of sales. So in 1887, Niche sold out, and so he got out of this West Seattle, but he soon after got elected to be city councilman for one of the wards, Seattle City Council, one of the wards which is now, I guess we're going to call it districts upcoming. So back then it was wards. And he served between 1887 and 1890. The other thing about that plat map is that that's the first mention of West Seattle in any document. But I was going through the newspapers, the local newspapers at that time. There basically was no mention of West Seattle until there started to be an ad that came out in 1887. And the ad, just to give you an idea of what it looked like. So this is basically the first mention in a newspaper of West Seattle. And I'll have this back table and you can look at it. And then and this was in the Intelligencer, which is the predecessor to the Post-Intelligencer, for about 8 months. And then you started to see mentions of West Seattle in articles after that. So it's basically because of this ad and the promotion of this area that they started to use the name West Seattle.
And that was 1885?
The plat was filed in 1885. That ad came out in 1887. Jump ahead. Then it didn't last very long. That was platted in 1885. By 1888, it completely changed, and now there was a company in California that established the West Seattle Land and Improvement Company, which is this right here, and this is the first plat that they did. And this is California money. So there was a person by the name of Thomas Ewing, and in the directories of the time he was referred to as a capitalist. He acquired this property, and the difference between this first one, which is basically for kind of subsistence farming for family farms, to this, the whole reason is technology, cable cars. And there were no cable cars in 1885, or if there were, it was back east. But by 1888, they realized, okay, we get them to the point and they can get up the hill using the cable car. And otherwise, it's going to be real tough hauling. So that's what made that difference, is the cable cars changed this whole outlook. I mean, the people who put that together at the time in 1885 were probably, that was the best use of the property, but by 1887, the lots, instead of being 5 acres, were like 1/20th of an acre. So you could also make a little bit more money that way. Also, I highlighted in yellow here at the bottom, this is the property, and the reason why it's so large is because that's the entire ownership of the Standleys when they acquired the property. So if you see the solid yellow, that's just 2 lots. And then I outlined the rest of the lots that the Standleys owned, right there on the bottom. Now another thing about this.
Question there.
Yes?
There's a question. We can't see the yellow. Can you point where
Yeah,
that is?
the yellow is right down here near the bottom.
Thank you.
Pass it out.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, sure. When you're looking at that, you'll see there's a dashed line and the whole area, or a solid line, the whole area south of that solid line is dashed. And the reason for that, and I was able to figure this out, is that at the time that plat was created, the developers did not own that area. And they did not buy it until 2 months later. And the only reason why I mentioned that is because that's exactly where the Standleys' property was. And it just so happens that 3 days after that plat was filed, and what's the date here? So October 16th, 1888 is when the plat was filed. 3 days later, on October 19th, 1888, Helen and Charles Merrick purchased the lot. But they purchased it from that company that didn't own the property yet. So things were a little bit more lax back then, apparently. They didn't, and there probably was some arrangement, some handshake or something, but the paperwork didn't go through until 2 months later, before they actually officially owned that property. But the Merricks didn't care. There was a proposal to put that cable car up. This was probably one of the closest places to the height of the hill to establish that cable car, and they were pretty excited about it at the time. But they didn't ever build. Now, Charles Merrick, who I actually have a photograph of Charles Merrick. And I'll put this out on the table too. So there's Charles Merrick. Now, Charles Merrick was Dr. Charles Merrick. He had come out here in 1883 and established his physician's office in Belltown. And then by 1887, he was hired to run the King County Poor Farm. King County Poor Farm was located down in where Georgetown is. And it was kind of the people in charge was the Catholic nuns. They were in charge of it, and then they hired him to be the doctor to take care of any individuals that had problems there. And so he and his wife was a matron, and he and his wife ran that. And it was really interesting to read some of the articles because they were just gushing about how honest he was. So there must have been a little bit of graft going on at those times, and they gave him a raise just because you're just so honest. We got to give you this raise. So it was great. So they bought it. Unfortunately, Merrick died of what they referred to as dropsy, which I think is congestive heart failure. And he died November 20th, 1890. So that was just about the time when the cable car was placed in. So he was probably just not quite ready to get it done. So then the Merricks owned it until 1903, and finally sold the property. And the people they sold it to, so I'm getting close to the end here, is to a Josephine Tabor. In the late summer, early fall, Josephine Tabor, age 38, and her mother, likely her mother, Almira Tabor, and she was 70 years old at the time, took an 8-mile ferry ride from the Coleman's Dock at the foot of Marion Street out to the ferry dock at Tuamish Head. I guess they were charging nickel back then, probably too. And it was the steamer that was running was the city of Seattle, that had been running since 1888 when that run first got established. It was still running in 1903. And so the Tabors probably walked up to the top of the hill, looked out towards the city, and they fell in love with it. Now, And because they had to walk, because the cable car that had been established in 1890 ceased running in 1897 during that depression. And the West Seattle streetcars, the municipal streetcar didn't get established until 1904. So there was a period of time when everybody had property up here on the top of the hill, had to walk up Ferry Avenue. Must not have been a very tiring when you're carrying your goods and everything up the hill. Why was she out here? Well, she had just been hired by the Seattle Public Library. And at the time, Seattle Public Library had 25 employees. And Josephine Tabor was the first professionally trained librarian to be hired by the Seattle Public Library. And she was placed in charge of the children's department. Now at the time, to bring it somewhat full circle, at the time, in 1903, the library was located in that 1861 University of Washington classroom building. It was located there between 1901 and 1906, before the Carnegie Library was built, where its present location is. Obviously, there's a couple buildings that have been, it's been rebuilt 2 times since then. But before that, for a brief period of time, the main library, the downtown library, was in the University of Washington building, where the Olympic Hotel is. She was in charge of the children's department. Now, one of the things the children's department did is that they would loan out books to various Seattle public school classrooms. There were no public school libraries at that time. So what they would do is they would send out 20 books to all 150 classrooms that they were dealing with at that time. And then they would have them for a while, then they would move them around to the next classroom, and so it would kind of circulate around so that there would always be new, fresh books to look at each of the classrooms. And so she was in charge of that. And then people thought so highly of her that in 1906, she was promoted to be in charge of the branch libraries. So of the Seattle Public Library branch libraries, she was placed in charge of that. And at that time, she was the second highest paid employee at the Seattle Public Library. So the city librarian was the highest paid employee. She was the second highest paid employee. And that was just about the time that she sold this property to the Standleys. In 1906, there were just 4 branches in Seattle Public Library systems: Fremont, Green Lake, one called South Branch, and University. So those were the 4 branches. She remained in charge of the branch libraries till her retirement in 1930, and the West Seattle branch got established in 1910. So between 1910 and 1930, she was in charge. And I was reading something about the beginning of the West Seattle branch, and they said they opened in February because there was such an interest and a clamor for the library to open, and they didn't even have their heat in place. So there was absolutely no heat, and it was uncompleted, but people just ran to the library to go there during that whole initial period of time. And by the summer, they eventually got everything fixed up, and but that first winter was a little cold in there. And Josephine never moved out here. She'd stayed in Seattle, lived in apartment houses her entire life. So I guess, and her mother passed away about 1907, I think. And so she never made it out here to West Seattle. She sold it to the Standleys, and then the house was built, and everything's gone on since then. So that's my little story of this place during that period of time. So I also have here's Josephine. So that's her photograph. And I'll put this at the back table so you can go through it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hey, my name is Bill Barnes, and my mother, I don't know if she was the longest serving member of the Old Curiosity employee, but she worked there for 25 years. So she had she started working there, I think, when she was 60. So she had a number of jobs, and mostly of them were in sales. She sold family portrait plans and so forth. But I think all the things that she told us about the old curiosity shop, we learned from her, and she was really good at researching the items that she dealt with. And as Joe can attest, that she was one of the best salespersons they ever had there. She was always the top producer. She made a habit of researching all of the different articles there, and she especially liked the native Indian carvings and the Russian icons. When people would come through town there and visit the old curiosity shop, as many of them did from different places around the country, she would make a point of getting to know them, and then she would maybe sell them something, and then she could keep in touch with them. And she had people back in the East Coast who said, if you ever find something like this, let me know. She would write them a letter, and I think you would like this, and they would just send her the money, and she would sell it. So she was a wealth of knowledge, and she had a knack for just connecting with people, and she loved the old curiosity shop, and especially all the people that worked there. The James family, of course, I'm very close to them, and as she got older, or she started, in her 60s, she was kind of a mother, grandmother to a lot of the younger employees. We used to drive her down on Saturdays and Sundays to, or when she would work on the weekends, to Safeway. And like a lot of mothers and grandmothers, to feed the children, we'd go to Safeway and get donuts for all the kids, she called them. And so she always looked after them. And we heard lots of interesting stories about what went on over there. And so, like I said, she considered that, I think, probably her dream job. And she loved the old curiosity shop, and she was, the quintessential employee. So the connection we have is through our family, is that we knew a lot about the Stanleys and the James through her working there. So in a way, we're connected through this to this house through my nephews, whose grandmother worked for the James family. Yes.
That's so encouraging that she started her new life career so late in life. I think a lot of us would be encouraged by that. But what did she do before that? What was her life before 60?
Well, besides the 6 children she bore, she had worked for a company called Family Record Plan, and she sold photographs. And she got me into it. I was kind of followed in suit. I went to work and sold photo plans as well. And then she went to work for an employment agency, which was selling in a way. She just had that natural gift for that. Then she went to work for SeaTac in some of the shops there, and she made friends there, of course. And then after all those years, then she landed at the old curiosity shop, or Yawks as we called it. And like I said, that was her. She just loved that and was so proud of being employed there, and we learned a lot of it. But we still had carvings that she had purchased over the years, and she made friends with all the native carvers. And one unfortunate fact is, I guess, may know of a gentleman who was shot by the police there, a Native American carver, John Williams. She knew him. She used to buy things from him, and she encouraged all of these guys who would come around to, they'd bring her scrimshaw and ivory and different things, and she tried to help them out as well. So as a mothering person. So.
What was her full name?
Her name?
Full name, yeah.
Ann Elizabeth Barnes. So
I'm not sure if everyone got the connection there, but Eric, that's your grandmother. So when you first looked at this house, you didn't know there was a connection. Well, we did.
Eric, can you get on the mic?
Sure.
You can bring it full circle here.
So this is my Uncle Bill. And then his mother was my grandmother Ann, who worked for Joe at the Curiosity Shop. And when my wife and I moved here 10 years ago, there was a table right here. This house was for sale. And a lot of these pictures that you see were sitting on the table. And we realized that there was this connection with this house to the Curiosity Shop, with my grandmother, and decided that, you know, this was serendipitous and we should try to buy this house. And so we did, and now we're here for 10 years.
Sorry, and I think that older mom.
No, all the time you've known Marianne since 1974, you didn't know that your dad was friends with Joe, who is part of the Standley family.
I've been like a little kid peeking out the window all day, looking for you.
Whatever that was.
I know you went away there. How are you? You won. You won.
Yes, sir.
My family's supposed to be everybody else is
Okay.
7 inches.
That's tragic. He was actually kind of a funny guy. I remember it when I first met him from years ago.
No, it looks like the garage is gone. We just did south foundation next to the house. So, anyway, so where do you live? You're 90 now?
And I got a little park by
She could teach me. Oh, not more this year. Is it a
Oh, yeah.
And that doctor, Bobby, what was his last name? Bobby. He came and introduced himself.
Oh, Bobby Wyndham.
Bobby
The
Wyndham.
doctor's son.
I can't believe you would know his first name was Bobby.
Well, he lived just down Palm Avenue for us for about 4 or 5 hours.
How many years ago was that since you've seen Bobby Wyndham? Hey, did you pull up that?
Probably about 70.
70 years. That's awesome. 70 years. That's really great.
Yeah.
Well, I would never recognize him, but when he told me where he lived.
Then you said to him, Bobby Wyndham, he was a pretty cute kid.
He was.
You're trying to find him in his face.
His father,
Where is it?
his father delivered me.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
He did?
Yep. Dr. Wyndham.
Dr. Wyndham delivered you.
Boy, he was
must have been a shock.
a very sober doctor too. It scared me every time I saw him. The agates on it was falling apart. He had cemented them in there with homemade cement and it was watching it disintegrate. Yeah. So it was falling apart. So we took the rest of it.
I'm listening behind you.
And that's